Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute, and welcome to tonight's program on the Middle East peace process and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Our guests tonight are very uniquely qualified to take part in a dialogue on this subject, as Egypt and Israel's representatives to the United States and to the United Nations, respectively. Ambassadors Ahmed El-Sayed and Dore Gold are both deeply involved with the ongoing efforts by Israel, by Egypt, by the Palestinians, and by the United States to find some way to move the stalled peace process forward. And both of these individuals bring a wealth of past experience to the Arab-Israeli dispute. Ambassador El-Sayed's association with the Arab-Israeli dispute reaches back to his participation in the Camp David peace negotiations and later talks to resolve the contentious dispute over Taba. Ambassador Gold, for his part, served as foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu prior to taking up his duties at the United Nations in New York. And he participated as an advisor to the Israeli delegation to the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. Both of these gentlemen are, in short, true experts on the Arab-Israeli dispute. And I'm sure that I join everyone here this evening in looking forward to their insights. Ahmed and Dore, thank you both very much for coming to the Baker Institute. Now it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Ambassador Ed Dirigian, who's our director, of course, and who has his own wealth of experience in the Middle East. Ed Dirigian, of course, was Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs when I was Secretary of State. He is the only American ever to have served as ambassador to both Israel and Syria. Ambassador Dirigian.
Thank you very much, Secretary Baker. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Council of Four, welcome to the Baker Institute, to this special event on the Arab-Israeli peace process, problems and prospects, with our very distinguished and experienced participants. I wish to say that there will be, at the end of the program, a question and answer period after the presentation and our discussion with the ambassadors. And written Q&A cards are available and can be presented to our student assistants. So just fill it in, and we will try to accommodate as many questions as we can. The very distinguished background Secretary Baker has noted of our two participants, Ambassador Maher Saeed and Ambassador Dore Gold, are really qualify them. We're very lucky to have both of them here to discuss the Arab-Israeli peace process at this very critical juncture in Middle East affairs, not only in the Arab-Israeli peace process, but with the looming crisis with Iraq. So this is extremely timely, and you can read their full biographies and their full qualifications in the program notes. It is now my honor. What we're going to do this evening is that I'm going to ask each one of the ambassadors to make a brief presentation of their views, after which I have the honor to moderate, or perhaps try to moderate, the discussion and debate that will follow, and lead it into a productive discussion on the problems and the prospects in the Arab-Israeli peace process. So join me in welcoming first the distinguished ambassador of Egypt to the United States, Ambassador Ahmed Maher Saeed.
So I speak from here. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much, Ed. What a treat to be able to land at George Bush Airport and come to the Baker Institute, be greeted by the Secretary and by Ed Geregel. I mean, this is, I think, the nearest place to the Middle East that I can find in the United States. And when you speak about experts in the Middle East, I think I'm very shy in speaking in front of Secretary Baker, who is, I think, the biggest expert, the American expert on the Middle East, and the work he has done, the beginnings that he started, and the road he has mapped for peace is actually the road that we are trying to follow till now. Let me thank the Institute for allowing me this opportunity to meet with my colleague, Dorigol, and have a discussion on the situation as we both see it in the Middle East. We hopefully will come to an understanding of what needs to be done in a very difficult situation. I want to start my presentation by a quotation that we have heard so much and so many times, which expresses the hopes of the people in the Middle East. But I have discovered that this quotation was not always full. So I want to have the full quotation of Micah 3 and 4. I think you all know this part, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The rest of the quotation goes like this: but they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. I think this is exactly the hopes that the people of the Middle East have for the future. And the problem is that until now, the Palestinian people have not been given their vine, not been given their fig tree, and they are still afraid. Afraid because they are subjected to a treatment that, despite Oslo, despite the agreements, a treatment that is not what we expected. When Egypt and President Sadat initiated peace, we thought that the Camp David agreement would be like Noah's dove, which left the arch and went and found that the waters had receded and came back with the olive tree. It took 15 years for many reasons. For the other parties, for the other aspects of the Middle East conflict to be treated, because myths still endured on both sides. Israeli myth that the Palestinian people did not exist, that you did not need to recognize their existence, that they were part of this or other country, that they would, their problem could be solved in the context of relations between Israel and other Arab countries. An Arab myth that you did not need to recognize Israel, you did not need to negotiate with Israel in order to retrieve your occupied land. It took, as I said, many years until finally light was seen by both the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the result was the Oslo Agreement. Let me say from the start, the Oslo Agreements are not perfect. They have many flaws. They do not respond 100% to what each party wants. But they were a manifestation that the parties were willing to look together in the same direction instead of looking at each other and waiting for the next fight. It always reminded me of a train that was on tracks going in a direction that was predetermined. Everybody knew what the direction was. And aboard the train, you could have fights, even fist fights. But everybody knew where the train was going. And that is why the negotiations under the previous Israeli government and the Palestinians was a very difficult negotiation. Many mistakes were made on both sides. Many conflicts arose, but there was a confidence that they knew where they were going to go. And then the paradox happened. I do not want to judge the Israeli government, but I can commiserate with the situation in which they found themselves. This was a government that came to power campaigning against the Oslo agreements, saying that these were bad agreements, bad for Israel, that they did not accept them. And then when elected, this government says that it's going to implement these agreements. I say I commiserate with them because it's very difficult to try to implement something in which you do not believe in. And that is, I think, the genesis of the difficulties that we are encountering. We feel in the Arab world that because this government does not believe in the philosophy of the Oslo Agreement, and because it is obliged by international law to try to implement them, it is many times trying to find excuses not to implement. So we hear excuses about security, about security cooperation. And then, when there is an agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis about security, a protocol that is signed, the Israeli government refuses to recognize it, although it is signed by its representatives. There is talk about reciprocity, and reciprocity is, by definition, a two-way street. And then we discover that their idea of reciprocity is that the Palestinians should respect and accede to certain demands that are very difficult sometimes, and that only when the Israeli government, which has decided that it is the judge of the actions of the Palestinian Authority, only when the Israeli government is satisfied will it try, perhaps, to implement some of the obligations, because we know that it does not want to implement all the obligations. We see now that although it has accepted the idea of further redeployments, now they want only one redeployment. We have seen that although in the Oslo Agreement it is said that no party should try to change the demographic situation in the occupied territories, we see that the Israeli government is intent on continuing to build new settlements. And we see that the Palestinians are asked to do things that are really impossible to do. For instance, they are being asked to build a democratic country. And at the same time, they are being asked to arrest people without any legal justification, just because the Israelis think that they are criminals, that they have, that they are responsible for some actions, reprehensible actions of terrorism. And at the same time, the Israelis say that the police force that the Palestinians keep is too big. All these things at the same time, and yet the Israeli government insists that the Palestinians have to do these three very difficult things to do at the same time be democratic, secondly arrest people without due cause, and thirdly have a very limited police force. And at the same time, nobody speaks about the security of the Palestinian people, the economic security that is caused by closure, the security of people who are arrested with no justification, the security of the Lebanese people who are bombed by Israeli planes. I do not want to get into these controversial things. What I want to say, honestly, is that what we have to do is what Secretary Albright said a few days ago, that there has to be re-established the spirit of partnership. And the spirit of partnership is to try to talk things together, to try to understand the point of view of the other party, not to always consider that you are right and the other party is wrong, to see that there are things that can be done together. Security is in the interest of both parties. They have to work for it together. Reciprocity is something that means both sides have to be ready to implement their commitments. Not have a situation where one decides that it is the judge and the other has to implement, and then we will see if we are going to implement it. What we would like to see is what Secretary Baker established in building the whole Madrid process, which was built on real reciprocity, which was built on principles of international law, particularly the principle of land for peace, which was built on the idea that both sides are partners, they have an interest, they have to work together for peace as partners. But today, unfortunately, the idea is not to work together, the idea is who will score more points. And this is extremely regrettable. We should stop here and examine our souls. Each party has to examine his souls and decide once and for all that the Israelis and the Palestinians will live side by side, that each one will have his own state, that in the context of peace, many of the problems that appear today can be solved. If you look at the other party, not as a prospective enemy, but as a partner with whom you want to live and work. And this, I can assure you, is something that the Palestinians have an interest to do, because they are the ones who don't have a country. They are the ones who want to establish a state. They are the ones who want to retrieve the land. So it is only normal that they would be eager to find a solution. And I know from the polls that we read that the Israeli people also accept the idea of a Palestinian state living in peace with Israel, that most of the Israelis accept the idea of a future Middle East where every party will have his vine and live under his fig tree and shall make, and none of them will be escaped. This is our hope for the future. This is what Egypt has started in 1977. This is what we continue to do, and we will continue to work for. But I believe that in order to do that, we have to be honest with our Israeli partners. We have to tell them what we think. We have to tell them how we see the way out of this dilemma. And we have to tell them, come, let us hand in hand work for a better Middle East, for a Middle East where all the peoples will enjoy equality, peace, prosperity, where we can work together against the extremists on all parties that want to destroy the dream that appeared so impossible in 1977 until Sadat's plane landed in Jerusalem and he was greeted by the Israeli people and the Israeli government with this enormous wave of hope that was justified in the case of Egypt and that I hope we will see justified in the case of Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and the whole Middle East, because this is what our children deserve, this is what we deserve, this is what we want to work for. And I think I have exhausted my 10 minutes, and I think we have a chance to speak right now.
Very much, Ahmed. It's my honor to present to you the Israeli Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Dori Goldberg.
I want to thank Secretary Baker, Ambassador Jerejian. The Middle East Middle East in 1998 has gone through many changes in comparison to where it was in 1991 when the Madrid Peace Conference began. But certain fundamentals that allowed the peace process to begin in 1991 are still with us. The two fundamental strategic conditions that enabled the peace process to take off were first the weakening and eventually the total demise of the Soviet Union, and secondly, the victory of the coalition in the war against Iraq. It's true we are now in a period where there's a new type of Russian activism, both with regards to the Iraqi situation and with regards to missile technology transfer to Iran. It is true that Saddam Hussein is trying to break out of the UN INSCOM regime with regard to weapons of mass destruction. Fundamental elements are still with us. And therefore, it is possible for us to move the peace process forward in terms of the overall conditions of the region. But the question is why it hasn't been working. What have been the fundamental flaws that have caused us to reach the impasse that we're in at present? If you ask Israelis what kind of reality has emerged in the Middle East, they will describe to you a very complex reality. On the one hand, in the last number of years, Israeli governments have succeeded in seizing upon these opportunities. And we've had important diplomatic breakthroughs in the peace process. The Declaration of Principles between Israel and the PLO from September 1993. Subsequent implementation agreements, Gaza-Jericho Agreement of 94, the interim agreement with the PLO in 1995, peace with Jordan in 1994, our opening up of trade offices in Morocco and Tunisia, North Africa, the opening of similar offices in Qatar and Oman and the Gulf. This is the positive register of movement that has been created in the peace process. But on the other hand, Israelis also experienced a different reality, a reality that hit them at home, the reality of an unprecedented upsurge in terrorism in the heart of Israeli cities. In Afula, in Hadera, outside of Netanya at Beit Lid, in Ramat Gan, in Ashkelon, repeatedly in Tel Aviv itself, and of course repeatedly in Jerusalem. Now, in the 3 years between the signing of the Oslo agreements and the last Israeli elections in May 1996, the number of fatalities Israelis experienced from these terrorist attacks was as great in those 3 years as we experienced in the previous decade. Approximately 250 Israeli fatalities, hundreds more wounded, permanently wounded for life. By the way, we had a very similar situation on our border with Syria. On the one hand, we had steady improvement in the contacts that existed between Israel and Syria. We had a dialogue between our ambassadors in Washington, the former ambassador of Israel to the United States, Itamar Rabinovich, and Ambassador Walid Muallim of Syria. This was also accompanied or followed by a meeting of our chiefs of staff. And this was followed by full-blown negotiations at the Y Plantation in early 1996. But we also experienced another reality in that dialogue with Syria. We had 2 mini-wars in Lebanon, Operation Accountability, Operation Grapes of Wrath. In the year before the Israeli elections, I asked the Israeli army before coming here, how many Katyusha rockets fell on northern Israel between May 1995 and May 1996. The response I got was 200 Katyusha rockets were launched by Hezbollah into northern Israel. Our northern city, Kiryat Shmona, was evacuated for a period of time. So again, we had this complex reality that was very hard to discern, one of diplomatic opportunity, but at the same time, a deteriorating domestic security situation. Now, time doesn't allow me to analyze all fronts at once. But let me start with the Palestinian side. What had gone wrong? Because normally when you sign peace agreements, your populace expects at a minimum, not economic rapid growth, but more security for people. You can have as many agreements as you want, but if children can't get on buses to go to school, if parents can't send their children to go on buses to go to school, then what have you achieved? So we asked ourselves what had gone wrong. And when the Oslo Accords were originally conceived, there had been an idea. It had been seen that the fundamentalist organizations among the Palestinians, the armed fundamentalist organizations, Din al-Qassam units of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, were a growing force among the Palestinians. It was thought, it was observed, that there was a great drama occurring across the Arab world, a drama that set the old Arab nationalist elites against the new forces of armed fundamentalist Islam. I'm very careful about my language because the problem is armed fundamentalist Islam, not Islam. Islam is not the enemy of Israel, and it's not the enemy of the West. We reject those notions. But there was this struggle going on. We see it in Egypt. We see it in Algeria in a greater extreme. And it was thought that Chairman Arafat would come to the Gaza Strip and he would enter into this drama. He would be the Palestinian version of this drama, and he would struggle against these organizations. In early 1996, the head of Israeli military intelligence, Major General Moshe Ya'alon, appeared before the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Now, normally an appearance like that is an executive session, and it's not something that's open to the public. Of course, the next day, his testimony appeared in Yediot Achronoth, in Ma'ariv, in Haaretz, and all the Israeli newspapers, not in the Jerusalem Post. So I'll make reference to the leaks in the newspapers, not to the original text. But the leaks were all identical. General Ya'alon made two observations of what had been going wrong as we were implementing the Oslo Accords. Observation one was that instead of the Hamas military infrastructure shrinking in the areas under Chairman Arafat's control, it had expanded. And the second observation, which was important for us to note, was why. He said one important observation. He said Chairman Arafat was preserving this situation, permanent status negotiations with Israel. 6 weeks after that testimony was given, 4 bus bombs went off. 2 in Jerusalem, 1 in Tel Aviv, at the Dizengoff Center, and 1 in Ashkelon. 70 Israelis died. Now, when the government of Israel came to power in May 1996, it ran on a very clear platform: peace and security. Yes to the peace process. Yes to the peace process, but a peace process that delivers more security for Israelis, not less security. Because that's the bottom line again. Now the question is, how do you go about doing that? How do you achieve that goal? And the key word that the Prime Minister emphasized in repeated appearances, his appearance before the joint session of Congress in July 1996, was the word reciprocity. Because the struggle against terrorism, against the Hamas and Islamic Jihad military infrastructure in the heart of Palestinian-controlled territories was a Palestinian obligation that appeared in the Oslo agreements. So reciprocity was a very simple principle. You do your end of the bargain, we do our end of the bargain. But if you don't do your end of the bargain, it's not a one-sided giveaway. I mean, the world has been saying to Israel, land for peace, not land for nothing. So the idea was put forward, reciprocity. And we actually put reciprocity into the Oslo process formally in January 1997. We were coming to an end of negotiations over the Hebron Protocol. Abu Mazen approached me. I was at the home of the American ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk. And Abu Mazen came up with a list of 4 or 5 important issues for the Palestinians that they wanted to see us implement during 1997, a kind of work plan for 1997. And they wanted us to recommit ourselves to these 4 or 5 issues that were of great importance to the Palestinians. These included the further redeployment process. These included prisoner releases. These included re-entering negotiations on interim issues like a Palestinian airport, a Palestinian seaport, safe passage, economic issues. I took the list back to the Israeli leadership, to Prime Minister Netanyahu, to Defense Minister Mordechai, to Foreign Minister David Levy. We went over the list, and I was told we can accept this list. We can accept to recommit ourselves to things that are already in the agreement. But Dori, they said, develop another list of what are the things we want from the Palestinians in 1997. So we developed another list. The list included issues that were of political importance to us. For example, finally changing the PLO charter that calls for our destruction. Also the question of whether the Palestinian Authority could have offices in areas outside its jurisdiction, for example, in Jerusalem. But we also turned to our security establishment to identify very specific issues that we want, commitments. We wanted the Palestinian Authority to undertake again and implement that related directly to this problem of bus bombings. So there were things like the collection of illegal firearms. I'm not going to go through the whole list. There were also other issues, like, for example, arresting and prosecuting those involved in terrorism, not just taking them in and letting them out the next day. There was also a very important phrase we put in, which was combating systematically and effectively terrorist organizations and infrastructure. I keep using this word infrastructure. Terrorism does not occur because somebody wakes up one day and says, my GNP per capita dropped, therefore I'm going to go on a suicide bombing. Terrorism occurs because there's an organization supporting terrorism, because there are people who mobilize suicide bombers, because there are people who have laboratories that manufacture explosive materials, regulation military explosives, people who move the explosive materials from the Gaza Strip to a frontal staging area near Jerusalem, people who scout a site and notice when do the Jews do most of their shopping in the market and pick an hour that's a very good hour for attack. And of course people are moving money to pay everybody off. Now that whole infrastructure has to be dismantled in order to combat terrorism. So we put that in with our list of things that were important to us. We put these two lists together to save time, because we were at the end of negotiations on Hebron. We decided that it would be called an American document, and therefore at the time of the signing of the Hebron Protocol, Ambassador Dennis Ross read our list and the Palestinian list to both leaders, to Chairman Arafat, to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Both men acknowledged the lists, and we had an introductory paragraph that both sides agreed to. The introductory paragraph said, from now on, the Oslo process will be based on the principle of reciprocity. Both men said yes. Dennis Ross took out his pen and signed the agreement. It became known as the Note for the Record. We'll have a big surprise for many people. If you look at the Note for the Record and you take out a pen and you figure out who did what, you're going to find that Israel implemented every single commitment that it undertook in the Note for the Record. And unfortunately, I don't say this because I want to score points. I say this with sadness. The Palestinian Authority of Chairman Yasser Arafat did not implement a single commitment in that American signed document. Now that leaves us, basically, where do we go from here? What we are trying to do, despite the enormous losses that we've had, despite the fact that we have increasing evidence of the use of violence as a negotiating tool in these contacts with the Palestinian Authority, we want to take an impaired peace process and make it work. That is our goal. Therefore, the Prime Minister has made proposals saying that we are willing to go ahead with the further redeployments. We, by the way, in March of 1997, offered the Palestinian Authority an enormous increase in the area under its control. We offered a first further redeployment before we got any of their commitments taken care of. We offered a first phase of further redeployment that would have increased Area A, the area where the Palestinians have full security and full civilian control, from 2.8%, that's all they were given by our late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Foreign Minister Peres, from 2.8% to 10.1%. That's an increase by a factor of 3. The Oslo Accords say nothing about how much land you're supposed to give in further redeployments. They just say Israel does it. It talks to the Palestinians about land when it comes to permanent status. But in the interim period, it's a unilateral Israeli act. We offered that in March. Chairman Arafat wanted more. He told Lally Weymouth of the Washington Post that he wanted 92% of the West Bank before entering into permanent status negotiations. All right, so he didn't get what he wanted, but In the agreement, it's something we offer. Now, we offered these elements. They were not accepted. It seems to us the best way for us to break out of this impasse, I would base it on two elements. One, we must remove violence, either direct violence or indirect violence, as a negotiating tool, as something which is a chip to be used in negotiations. When the late President Sadat came to Jerusalem, he used a very important phrase in front of the people of Israel and won their hearts. He stood in the Knesset and he said, "No more wars." And in fact, even though the negotiations with Egypt were very difficult, and there were impasses, and they tried regenerating negotiations at different times and different locations, Egypt never used the threat of force to win a concession from the Begin government. When things got stuck, you didn't suddenly see two more brigades of Egyptian tanks appearing in Sinai. It didn't happen. Unfortunately, violence has been a repeated negotiating tool in our contacts with the Palestinian Authority. So first of all, you must remove violence from the negotiating table. The second thing we have to do is move as quickly as possible to the permanent status negotiations. And I say this for a very simple reason. Men try and design agreements the best they can, but agreements aren't always designed well. This agreement has in it very different expectations from the interim period. Chairman Arafat thinks he should get 92% of the West Bank in further redeployments. It doesn't say it in the agreements. There's a gap in expectations. The gap in expectations creates frustration. And rather than the interim period being a period of confidence building, it's a period of confidence erosion. And we have to create the partnership that was originally envisioned in these accords. So that's why we must move as quickly as possible to permanent status. And in doing so, the most important thing leaders can do is adjust the expectations of their people. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been speaking to the Israeli public with very clear signals and adjusting the expectation of the Israeli public. At first, he was not excited about Oslo. It's true. He saw the defects, as did others on the labor side of the political spectrum. He then went ahead and implemented the Hebron Protocol and turned over what is essentially the second holiest city in Judaism, the Palestinian control. He did it. His predecessors didn't. And then, when he started talking loosely, I say loosely because he didn't want to use precise terminology. He wanted to give a signal to the public about permanent status. He spoke about it, used a term, alone plus, making reference to the famous plan of the former foreign minister Yigal Allon for compromise. So he has been moving the Israeli body politic towards a grand compromise. That is also necessary on the part of Chairman Arafat. If we can remove the violence from this negotiation, if we can get both sides to adjust their expectations, we might have bridgeable differences for a permanent status peace settlement. That's what's required to make this work. This peace process has not been smooth. Many Israelis have lost their lives, but the people of Israel and the government of Israel are determined to make it work. Thank you.
Gold. Both Ambassador Maher and Ambassador Gold have reviewed from the Camp David Accords through the Madrid peace process to Oslo the continuum, if you will, of the Arab-Israeli peace process. Both have referred to the strategic objective that was laid down in 1991 at the Madrid Peace Conference, a comprehensive peace settlement between Israel and all of its immediate neighbors, based on direct face-to-face negotiations and under the aegis of two critical UN Security Council resolutions, 242 and 338, i.e. the concept of land for peace. Both mentioned some of the positive results. The Israeli-Jordanian Treaty of Peace, which was negotiated directly between King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin. The Hebron Agreement under Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Palestinian Authority and Yasser Arafat. These are all very important step forwards. But now, gentlemen, the Israeli-Palestinian talks are severely stalled. Some say paralyzed. And there have been no negotiations between Israel and its northern neighbors, Syria and Lebanon, since at least February of 1996. The press that you are painfully and abundantly aware about has had headlines: New York Times, February 3rd, Israeli-Palestinian impasse seen as end of U.S. peace effort. The peace process is now on an artificial respirator. A poll taken by Tel Aviv University indicated that a majority of Israelis surveyed were convinced that the peace effort had basically come to a stop. In a cursory reading of the Arabic press, there is much gloom and doom. The issue, and no one doubts the desire for peace on the part of both the Arabs and the Israelis. Both have suffered greatly. But the issue really is, I think, twofold. And I'd like to ask Ambassador Maher one question and Ambassador Gold one question to start the dialogue going. Ambassador Maher, what specifically must the Arab parties do, can they do, to resuscitate the process in real terms? Not just rhetorically, but in real terms. And Ambassador Gold, is this impasse a situation the government of Israel thinks it can tolerate and live with? Or is it seriously considering specific initiatives to move the process forward, not only on the Israeli-Palestinian front, but also on the Israeli-Syrian and Lebanese fronts? So, gentlemen.
Thank you. I think, as I said before, Ed, that this is a partnership. I don't think any party alone can resuscitate this process that is in very difficult situation, as you yourself said. Look at the situation as it is. Ambassador Gold spoke about the necessity to remove violence. I think this is extremely important, and we totally agree with it, although when he compares the situation of Egypt and the Palestinian Authority, I think this is not a very fair comparison. Egypt is a state. President Sadat was the head of a centralized state, and the Palestinian Authority is not yet a state. And the instruments that are given to Yasser Arafat are not the instruments of a real state. I mean, his action is hampered by the actual situation on the ground, by the fact that he does not have all the authority of a state, that he suffers, the economic situation in the territories suffer from continuous closure by the Israelis, by the fact that the Palestinian territories are actually under siege, not only because of the closures, but because of the difficulty of exporting goods from Egypt and Jordan to the Palestinian Authority territories. There are many difficulties that are encountered by the Palestinian Authority, and the economic situation, the dire economic situation that is prevailing in the territories is one of the situations exploited by the extremists in order to foment trouble and violence. And the extremists on both sides have to be fought, not only on the Palestinian side, but we see extremists on the Israeli side, and they have to be fought. Also, about the expectations, I think the Palestinian people have to have expectations of a better future. But are we asking them to adjust their expectations to what they hear from official Israelis and maps that are being distributed that say that the Israelis will keep 52, 55, 60% of the Palestinian territory under Israeli sovereignty? Is this what we call adjusting their expectations? This is adding to their despair. When we talk about Israel having implemented all its obligations, I see here in this famous document that Ambassador Gold mentioned, for instance, talk about the first phase of further deployments will be carried on during the first week of March. I see in the accompanying letter of Secretary of State Christopher that he speaks about all three phases of further redeployments, and we see the Israelis now refusing the very principle of three phases. So what is needed, I think, is for hope to be revived, the spirit of partnership to be revived, real reciprocity to be implemented. And I'm asking Ambassador Gold, why is it that when the responsibles for security on both sides agreed on a document about security cooperation, which is one of the obligations on the Palestinian side, why is it that the Israeli government objected to this document? Because it mentioned reciprocity. And the Israeli government said that it refused to consider on the same level the Israeli extremists and the Palestinian extremists. If we are talking about reciprocity, then we have to be fair and to have to be consistent, and we have to accept. Here are the Palestinians, a document drafted by the United States and accepted by the Palestinians and the Israelis about cooperation, and after all, this is what the Israelis say is the most important aspect of cooperation, security cooperation, and it is rejected by the Israeli government. So we have to work together. We have to understand that this is not a zero-sum game. If the peace process dies, we all suffer. If the peace process succeeds, we all succeed. And this is unfortunately not the spirit with which we see the Israeli government approaching the present situation. I think we should sit together. We should see what has been implemented, what has not been implemented. The negotiations about the port, the airport, encounter many difficulties. I think they are surmountable, but they have to be decided. The question of entering into final status negotiations. This is an extremely appealing idea. But let me ask you, how is it if we are not able to reach agreement on small things? How are we going to solve the very important problems of the refugees, of Jerusalem, of the borders, if we are not capable of solving small problems that are in this document and that have not been implemented? The whole idea of Oslo was, as somebody called it, incrementalism, meaning implement small steps in order to create a spirit of confidence between both sides, allowing them to tackle the big problems of the future. And when we talk about further deployments, let me remind Ambassador Gold about what's in the agreement. The third phase of the Israeli redeployment is to military locations, to the settlements. I mean, they would not withdraw from the settlements. They would withdraw to military locations, and Jerusalem is reserved to the final status negotiations. Doesn't this amount to at least a big proportion of the West Bank, not the 10, 12, or 13% that we are talking about? These are the questions that have to be honestly tackled. But the main question is, have we decided that the Palestinian people have rights, that the Israeli people have rights, that the future can only be in two states living together in peace and cooperating in order to build prosperity and security for all sides? This is the question that, unfortunately, till now, the Israeli government has not asked itself, has not provided an answer to, although the Israeli people seem, in most of the polls that I have seen, to accept this vision of the future. That is the problem.
I've been asked one question, and there are some challenges that push one in a slightly other direction, and I'll try and balance between them. Okay. The dire economic situation. One of the things we tried to do, as of right after the Israeli elections was immediately change this issue of closure. Why does the government of Israel repeatedly put a closure on the West Bank? Because we've had horrible terrorist bombings, and we have to prevent people coming in who on the backpack might have a whole load of explosives, willing to blow themselves up, as it happened in a cafe in Tel Aviv last spring. Now, when we came into power, one of the first things we did, the current government did, was to immediately seek to lift the closure. There were exactly 22,000 Palestinian work permits in May 1996. This was lifted within 2 months to 55,000 work permits. And there were approximately another 50,000 illegals, because there is no real border between the West Bank and pre-67 Israel. So you had about 100,000 Palestinian workers already working in the Israeli economy by the summer of 1996. In addition to that, the government of Israel decided to do something else. Over the last number of years, because of these repeated closures and in response to terrorism, Israel began to take in foreign workers from Asia, from Eastern Europe, from Romania, from Thailand, from elsewhere. And the Interior Ministry took a decision to begin to reduce the number of foreign workers from far away and allow the Palestinian workers to take up their former workplaces. The best thing for the Palestinians would be if we could develop the Palestinian economy very quickly. But until that happens, in the short term, reliance on the Israeli economy is a practical way of protecting a reasonable GNP per capita. And that was the spirit that was used. Now, this is a vicious circle. If you have a situation in which known individuals who are involved in Islamic Jihad and Hamas, Izzadin al-Qassam units, names that everybody agrees upon. I'm not speaking about people who work to collect money for a daycare center next to a mosque. I'm talking about people who were trained in Iran in the use of explosives. When you let those kind of people out of prison, and they don't go to begin to open up a little supermarket, a 7-Eleven on the way to Ramallah, instead they begin organizing cells for further activity. When that stuff happens, you get a vicious circle. Then we've got to protect ourselves against this kind of terrorism. The best way to regain better economic situation for the Palestinians and better security for Israelis is for the Palestinian Authority to take its security responsibility seriously. And I'll tell you something. The side that could really tell the Palestinians about how to fight armed fundamentalism is Egypt, because you're doing it successfully. That's what has to be done. Now you can say, well, he's not a state, he doesn't have the power, but he's taken certain acts that are very problematic. I think the hardest thing for me as a negotiator, someone who worked with Chairman Arafat, who worked with Abu Mazen, was when we got information of a meeting that took place on the night between March 9th and March 10th in 1997 between Chairman Arafat and leaders of Hamas and other organizations, that Mr. Arafat had given a green light to resume terrorist attacks against Israel. We shared that information with the United States intelligence services. Now that is not just having enough capability, that is giving a green light to use violence to move negotiations, to break out of an impasse. This isn't even questionable. This is absolutely certain. This occurred. No. The State Department spokesman in 4 days changed the official U.S. reaction. They called for a red light from Chairman Arafat, which was the way of saying there was a green light. Now, this is very, very serious. We're not talking about scoring points in a debate. We're talking about saving Israeli lives and saving the peace process. Now, on the security document you mentioned, I think it's just important to clear the air on this. There was a security document negotiated between representatives of the planning branch of the Israeli army, representatives of Amin al-Hindi's organization, and with presence of American intelligence official. That security document was negotiated ad rem, meaning it had to still have the approval of the political echelons on both sides. Now, our objection, the objection of the political echelon, as well as the military echelon, because I should state as a clear fact that also the Minister of Defense didn't approve the document, nor did the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army. The problem was that the document lacked specificity. It wasn't that reciprocity as you depicted it. I think that I know as a fact was not the issue. The issue was we need specificity. In the note for the record, we have principles of security that we put in January 1997.
If we're calling on Israel to take specific acts, we need specificity about how do you go about, for example, combating systematically and effectively terrorist organizations and infrastructure. So the political echelon and the higher military echelon wanted that document improved. But that isn't a rejection of a document because of the reasons. I know that might have appeared in the Washington Post or some other place, but that is not the reason why the document was not acceptable. If we can get to specifics, if we can move the process along so that security can be handled. Security is not an Israeli phobia. It is not a kind of complex that Israelis have had. We have lost a lot of Israelis in repeated bus bombings in the heart of the city. I don't know any other nation that takes those kinds of risks for peace. But we are doing it. And all we're demanding is the other side fulfill its side of the bargain. It may be politically incorrect to demand reciprocity. It may be politically incorrect to demand that the other side fulfill its side of the bargain. But that's what we have to do to protect both our people and this process. A process which is accompanied, in which terrorism and diplomacy accompany one another in parallel, will be a process that will become discredited. And then we'll all be in big trouble. It was on the verge of being discredited in May 1996. We've been trying to save it.
If I may add, I think it is true that the process would be discredited if both sides do not enjoy security. But here again, this is a question of reciprocity. I think the Palestinians are subjected to violence. The Lebanese are subjected to violence. And let me ask Mr. Gold, who liberated the leader of Hamas and sent him back to the Palestinians? And for what reason? Do you remember the circumstances in which this was done? Do you remember Abu Marzouk, who was prisoner in the United States? And for months, we heard the Israelis clamor that this was a very dangerous terrorist, that he should be extradited to Israel. And then Israel one day decided that it didn't want him anymore for political reasons. You understand that sometimes it is very difficult to take certain measures. And if the Israeli government, which is a state, could not sustain or could not keep the leader of Hamas in prison and could not continue to ask for the extradition of Mr. Abu Marzouk, I'm not talking about the merit of the case, but how are you asking the Palestinians to take measures that the powerful state of Israel is not capable of taking? The security is the security of both parties. You talked about the number of Israeli who died, and we condemn all terrorism, but could you tell me the number of the Palestinians and the Lebanese who died under Israeli bombs? Could you tell me the suffering of the Palestinian people under closure? It's not, nobody has the monopoly of suffering, Mr. Gold. Nobody has the monopoly of being always right. This is something that we both have to work together. You cannot come every time and say the other party does not implement its obligations. We have rights, we Israelis have rights, we are suffering, the other people are suffering too. And it is our responsibility to put an end to the suffering of the Israelis, of the Palestinians, and everybody by looking together toward the future and not coming and telling the Palestinians that we are going to take more of your land. We are going, yesterday, we are going to build more settlements. The final settlement will only give you 40% of your territory, and we don't want you to be an independent state. You cannot tell them all these things and then tell them not to despair and tell them to become your partners. We want the Palestinians and the Israelis to be partners. And partners have to be equal, and you have to adjust your expectations, as the Palestinians have already adjusted their expectations. What we see, unfortunately, is that the Israelis are not adjusting their expectations and asking everybody else to adjust their expectations. This is the problem.
According to news accounts, Secretary of State Albright, when she completed her recent visit to the region, was reported to berated both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Chairman Arafat, saying, "I'm sick and tired of hearing you giving me a pile of complaints about the other side." And the question I have for both of you is it truly beyond
the genius of negotiations and diplomats and prime ministers and Palestinian chairmen to really find a negotiated way out of this seeming conundrum of going forward from the Hebron Accords, which a Likud prime minister signed, which was historically very significant that a Likud prime minister signed the Hebron Accords, buying off on Oslo in the Palestinian equation, and going from the commitments of Oslo, which are staged withdrawals for peace and security, to final status negotiations, because a very important point was made here. Can this process move forward if agreements that have already been reached are not being carried out, and to jump into final status negotiations? But it seems that the American plan is exactly that, is how to make the transition from phased withdrawals, peace and security, to final status issues. Is this beyond the genius of diplomacy? Is there not some way that we can get over this?
We have the expert here. I think we should ask Secretary.
I will ask Secretary Baker to come up. And
No, I think it's not beyond if there is goodwill, if there is a determination to do it, if there is an active American role that is constant and that is clear-cut, and that, I mean, sometimes it is important to scold both parties, and somebody said, I think an Israeli official or somebody said that they should bang their heads together in order to find an agreement. I think this is extremely important. But this is not beyond the imagination of diplomats and politicians, particularly since we feel that on both sides, the people have a genuine desire to put an end to this untenable situation that is becoming more and more serious every day, I think.
Well, I actually believe that the permanent status negotiations have a reasonable chance of working, even though we've had such difficulties in the interim period. As I said before, the interim period simply wasn't well designed. We eroded confidence, we didn't build confidence as originally conceived. Another thing also happens, we're dealing with two political circles, a Palestinian political circle and an Israeli political circle. And every small step of the interim agreement requires the expenditure of enormous political capital by an Israeli prime minister or a PLO chairman. And in a certain sense, doing the grand deal and expending all the political capital at one time is easier. You also have a number of issues you're working with, so you can trade off between issues. When you're focused on one single issue alone, that issue becomes a microcosm for everything and becomes all the more difficult to do. So ironically, even though the issues are very difficult in permanent status, and you look at them and you think, how can you even move an inch in these issues? In a certain sense, they're much easier, because you expend the political capital at once on the whole deal, and because it's a package, you can trade off between issues. But as I said before, I think that's what we have to move towards now. But I ultimately believe in one other thing. Historically, the peace process has had an important American role. But at the same time, it's the two parties groping towards each other which ultimately seizes the moment. I'm thinking of the first contacts between Israel and Egypt in 1977 that occurred in Morocco at the time when Secretary Vance was trying to put together the Geneva Peace Conference. I'm thinking of the first contacts between Israel and the PLO, Israel and Jordan. So there is a school of thought that says, only the United States can come and bang heads together and make it work. But there's also substantial evidence that if the two parties don't have the political will to grope towards one another, to really want the agreement to work, no matter what the best external services do to help you, you won't clinch a deal. We have to reinvigorate the mutual desire of Palestinians and Israel to cut a deal.
May I add a note to that? There's certainly no disputing the fact that the parties themselves have to have the real intent for peace and goodwill in negotiations. But certainly, I think the record shows that when the United States has stood tall and the American leadership, be it Democratic or Republican, has been able to take the political heat from both sides and has put down ideas and proposals in crunch times that there has been forward movement on the peace process. Kissinger in the disengagement agreements, certainly President Carter in the Camp David framework with a Likud Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, and certainly President Bush and Secretary Baker in '91 with another Likud Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir. I think the American role becomes essential when there are points in the equation, as we're seeing today. And my next question to both of you, and we could spend many more hours and the clock is ticking, but I think there's great concern over the threat of a real resurgence of violence in the region on either side. If this peace process really does grind down to a real halt. We know that next week there'll be envoys sent to Washington, and hopefully that some progress will be made. But I would like to ask you both of your assessment of this, because peace and security are, as you've stated, Dori, essential parts of the equation, and as you've also stated, Ahmed, are essential parts of the equation. But what, in your view, will be the implications if there is a resurgence of violence from whatever side, and the consequences of a moribund peace process on the region?
I think we agree that we all have to work to put an end to violence. And we also have to agree that desperate situations encourage people extremists on both sides, to resort to actions of terrorism that we condemn. So I think what we have to do is to go forward in the negotiations, not to allow the terrorists and the extremists on both sides to impose their agendas on us. It is difficult. It is not easy. When people die, when bombs explode, it is not always easy for politicians to continue negotiations, but it is certainly the prerogative of statesmen to decide that they will not allow terrorists and extremists to impose their agenda on them. I think we have to continue negotiations. The American role is extremely important, and it is true, as you said, that it is imperative that both sides be desirous of reaching an agreement, and I think both sides want to reach an agreement. The problem is what sort of agreement, but our experience in Camp David, I think we were locked there for 13 days. There were more drafts, agreements than there were days, but they were all except one American drafts, and only through an American active role did President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin finally reach the Camp David agreement. By the involvement, the personal involvement, I think this had never happened in history before, of a President of the United States chairing a drafting committee that met for hours and hours and hours. So it is very important for both sides to desire to reach an agreement, and I think they both want an agreement. It is important for a friend of both sides, the United States, to continue to play an active role. And I reciprocate what Ambassador Rigol said. I think that the Israelis have to adjust their expectations and realize that the aim of the whole exercise is as it is said in the Declaration of Principle, that it is time to put an end to decades of confrontations and conflict, recognize their mutual legitimate and political rights, and strive to live in peaceful coexistence and mutual dignity and security, and achieve a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace settlement and historic reconciliation through the agreed political process. I think this is the aim. This is what we should have our eyes on, and I can tell you this is achievable. The example of Egypt and Israel is a proof. The Declaration of Principles in itself is a proof. The peace treaty between Jordan and Israel is another proof. So we have to continue, and I think we have to be optimistic.
You asked about the resurgence of violence. My central point is that we have had a resurgence of violence from the beginning of this process. It is not as though we've had a situation where There was this wonderful peace process. It was all tranquil and calm, and all of a sudden it's now declining, and now we're facing a resurgence of violence. I mean, what does it mean when you have 120 Israelis wounded, 30 killed, and a given bus bombing? That in itself is a resurgence of violence. Now, this also leads me to the question of the American role. Everyone understands that both the parties themselves have to grope towards each other, and if they don't have the political will to do it, no one can do it for them. But at the same time, we've also seen an American role, which has been critical at many times. The thing I'm always concerned about is whether the American role will allow one side or the other to believe that the United States will deliver the other party. And then what happens is you don't have to adjust your expectations. You wait to have the U.S. deliver it. I have seen that in negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. I've seen times when there's a tough article in the New York Times that somehow filters into the Middle Eastern press, and there's an expectation on the Palestinian side that the U.S. is going to deliver the State of Israel in negotiations. And as a result, Palestinian negotiating positions harden. And things that were acceptable last week are suddenly not acceptable this week. And I have a specific case in mind, which I can't share with everybody, but it occurred about a month and a half ago. So it's a very, very delicate thing. We have to remember that, fighting terrorism, Mr. Arafat's Palestinian Authority is going to have to fight terrorism. You can't get the United States to do it for him. So the real question is bringing the parties to compliance and what they have to do now, laying out a sense of the future in which the parties can find bridgeable differences. As far as the resurgence of violence, there are always people who say the peace process doesn't go forward, there'll be more Soviet influence in the Middle East. We used to hear that in the 1960s and the 1970s. If the peace process doesn't go forward, something else will happen. So it's a convenient thing to say. If the peace process doesn't go forward, if Mr. Netanyahu and his government don't make concessions, then violence will surge in the Middle East. Well, we've had violence in the Middle East, and we're trying to stop the violence. And I think that has to be our point of departure.
I think we all agree that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the political heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But the Israeli-Syrian relationship is truly its geostrategic equation and dimension, and we don't hear much about that in the almost total focus on the Palestinian track in the last year or two. What I'd like to ask both of you is your assessment of whether or not it is possible to move forward on that northern front, because certainly if there is another war, God forbid, in the Middle East, it is possible that it could come from a conflict, either through miscalculation or deliberate, even though the strategic equation has changed, as you said in the beginning of your remarks, in the region. But we know that logic doesn't travel very well sometimes in the Middle East, and wars occur, and people are surprised by them. So the question really is, is the government of Israel prepared to engage in serious negotiations with Syria and with Lebanon? And has the government of Israel abandoned consideration of a Lebanon first option or a unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon? And I'd like to get comments from both of you, but first to Dory on that, and then to Ahmed.
Syria, as you point out, Ed, is a very important actor in the Middle East, and very important for a strategic peace, a peace that basically terminates the direct military confrontation that has been part of the Arab-Israel conflict since 1948. In my judgment, both Syria and Israel can find common ground to move forward, to address both of their interests in the peace process. Lebanon is part of that overall equation for reasons I've already explained. I mean, today we face a situation in which Iranian cargo aircraft land at Damascus International Airport, unload Katyusha rockets, shoulder-fired missiles, other implements of war. They're transshipped to the Bekaa in eastern Lebanon, where they're used either against Israeli soldiers in the security zone or against northern Israel itself. By the way, the Bekaa and the training areas of Hezbollah are also used against other states in the Middle East. because Hezbollah is not just a problem for the towns of northern Israel, for Kiryat Shmona, it's a problem for Bahrain, it's a problem for Kuwait, it's a problem for eastern Saudi Arabia. And therefore, should we advance initiatives in the future that would lead to the dismantling of the Hezbollah militia, the same way other militias in Lebanon have been dismantled, this would not only improve the security of northern Israel, I would add it would improve the security of every state in the region that faces a threat from Iranian-supported terrorism. I believe that many countries in the region share this common problem, and we shouldn't get tied down to slogans. Lebanon first, Lebanon in the middle. Some people are afraid Lebanon last. But I think that we have a number of mutual interests, and if we approach this with a regional perspective, I believe that Israel and Syria have a good basis for moving forward. We are aware of the importance of Syria in the region.
Ahmed, do you have a comment on
No, I think that it is very important not to forget that peace will not be comprehensive until there is a solution for Syria and Lebanon. And we know the principles on which the solution should be built. I mean, there is no way to see that peace is established between Israel and Syria without withdrawal from the Golan. And the question of security is an important question for both sides. It does not necessarily imply the occupation of other people's territory. On the contrary, I think the occupation of the Golan is against the future security of Israel, because it will create a situation that people would like to change. And I think part of the problem in Lebanon is the occupation of southern Lebanon by Israel, which encourages actions of resistance against this occupation, and it is being exploited by forces of extremism. As to the question of Lebanon first or Lebanon last, I think we all agree, and everybody agrees, that practically you will have to solve the problems of Syria and Lebanon with Israel together.
One last question. Our time is running out. There's so much to discuss here. What, in both of your respective views, is the impact of the Arab-Israeli peace process at this stage on the situation, the very dicey and critical situation in the Persian Gulf, especially vis-a-vis Iraq? Dory?
There has been an assertion made repeatedly at different times and from different quarters that the difficulties we're facing, understandable difficulties we're facing in the Arab-Israeli peace process, is affecting the Iraq/Gulf theater. I believe that there is no correlation between the Arab-Israeli sector and the Iraq-Gulf sector for the following reasons. Back in 1991, the United States gathered a very powerful coalition to defeat Saddam Hussein. And at the time, there was no Arab-Israeli peace process. In other words, peace process did not correlate with coalition. I recall being with scholars from the Gulf in October 1994, when Saddam Hussein massed armor in southern Iraq and threatened to repeat some kind of action against Kuwait. And the United States was very active at the time, trying to form some kind of coalition to resist this provocation in October 1994. At the time, the Arab-Israeli peace process seemed to be blazing forward. We had new agreements with the PLO, an agreement with Jordan, and at the time, the only country in the world that came to back the United States in a forceful way, the only country in the Arab world to back the United States, was Kuwait itself. Everybody else was, yes, maybe. So in other words, again, the correlation of a peace process moving forward and the existence of a coalition was non-existent. I believe that the two theaters, the Gulf theater and the Arab-Israeli theater, began to diverge from one another as early as 1987, when the United States began convoying reflagged Kuwaiti tankers at the time when the Intifada was blazing in the Arab-Israeli sector. And that divergence of the two sectors has been with us for many years. I believe ultimately the states of the Gulf are concerned with their security, with protecting themselves from either invasion from Iraq or subversion from Iran. That is their national security interest. And many times people try and read in ideological interests of solidarity with the Palestinians, etc. That's important. It's important for people's feelings. But when you say to a country, what is more important to you, your national security and self-protection, or an issue of ideological solidarity, ultimately it's national security and self-defense. Last but not least, I would say this. I think there is a rising sensitivity in certain parts of the Gulf area to too large and explicit a Western military presence. And that has more to do with the penetration of different fundamentalist organizations in those areas rather than, again, the Arab-Israeli peace process. So the Arab-Israeli peace process has its own logic, has its own necessity, but it does not affect the Gulf theater the way certain quarters have depicted it.
Ahmed, do you agree with that assessment?
Ed, let me, I want to make 2 or 3 considerations in this regard. First of all, I think the most important link between the two situations is the perception in the Arab's mind of a double standard. The perception, I mean, people in the street feel that there are resolutions of the Security Council, that there are decisions of the United Nations that are being forcefully implemented on one side and not implemented on the other side. This is a very important linkage in the perception of the people. And you can discuss intricate points of law about the differences, about the different situations, but you cannot change this perception in the Arab minds. And I think it was always existed because I remember during the creation of the coalition to counter the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, when the Iraqi leadership tried to exploit the problem of Palestine. If I'm not mistaken, the United States government position was that when we liberate Kuwait, we will then deal with the problem of the Middle East. There was some sort of a linkage. There was always a linkage. The last trip of Secretary Albright in the area was a trip that was qualified by some people as war and peace, meaning that it dealt in the same trip with the problem of Iraq and the peace process. So there is a linkage somewhere. But it does not mean that because that the Arab people have no position on the Iraqi situation in itself. The invasion of Kuwait was condemned by the Arab nation, and Egypt was foremost amongst which. Today, the position of the Arab countries is that Iraq has to implement the Security Council resolutions. The official position is that the fact that some resolutions are not implemented in some part of the world are no justification for not abiding by the resolutions. Secondly, we believe that the solution should be a diplomatic and political solution, that using force will not solve the problem. This is our position. So there is a position regarding the peace process. There is a position regarding the situation in Iraq, but there is definitely a linkage in the perceptions and in the minds of the people and in the facts.
The hour and a half has gone by so quickly, and I know we can continue for at least another 2 hours. What I would like to do is ask, there are a couple of questions from the floor. If anyone has any questions now, we can entertain some. The gentleman there, please. Okay, you could bring those up so we could start now. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ah, I see that this is a speech. The question and answer here is to both ambassadors. Thank you. the only way to real peace in the Middle East is by allowing a military parity between Israel and one or more Arab countries. Your opinions, please. Dory, you want to try to?
Well, if you try and make that equation, you get into the problem of which coalition against Israel? What combination are you speaking about? Military parity against whom? Against Kuwait? Kuwait isn't an adversary of ours. In my judgment, this is a hopeless exercise because you enter into the question, well, what's the Iraqi component of the equation? We know historically that Iraq has dedicated 20% of its ground forces against Israel in repeated Arab-Israeli wars in 48, 67, and 73. So do we use that as a basis for calculating this equation? I think that we're best off not going into this whole question of figuring out parity and military balances as a precondition for moving forward the peace process, because you can't calculate it.
I believe we should do two things. One of them is go forward with the idea of creating Middle East free of weapons of mass destruction. That would be an excellent way to start. And secondly, continue the political process.
Question for Ambassador Gold. Why does not Israel implement UN Resolution 425 concerning Lebanon, which calls for the immediate unconditional withdrawal from Lebanon? This way, there would be no reason for the Lebanese resistant fighters to continue fighting the occupiers.
Well, Resolution 425 also speaks about a number of other issues, such as security between Israel and Lebanon. And the fundamental problem that we're facing in Lebanon is the fact that Lebanese territory is being used repeatedly by Hezbollah against us. We also have statements made by leaders of Hezbollah that even if we were to withdraw, they would continue the struggle into, quote, northern Palestine, unquote. We are seeking a solution to Lebanon, a solution to the problem in southern Lebanon. We have no interest in remaining ad infinitum with our small presence in southern Lebanon. We would like a solution that allows security to be restored in a way that can be long-term security, that can remove the constant threat to our northern towns and villages, and that will involve Lebanon assuming responsibility for the areas in its south and not having this area a kind of a wasteland in which militias are in control and constantly threatening our border.
Here. Is it true that 92 to 96% of Palestinians already live under Palestinian jurisdiction in areas A and B?
I can pick that up. The answer is it's probably closer to 96 or 98% of the Palestinian population in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip are today under Palestinian administration, meaning either in Area A, where you have full security and full civilian control, or Area B, where you have full civilian control and partial security control. So that it's very difficult to speak about Israel sitting now and occupying the Palestinian people.
If I may, I think the question is totally irrelevant, and the answer is even more irrelevant. We are talking about territories, not about people. Are we going to resort again to this idea of land without people and people without a land, this idea that has made everybody suffer so much? I think the agreements, the international agreements, the resolutions speak about territories. They do not count heads. And the idea that Israel tries to propagate, I think, is falsehood, is absolutely irrelevant, and I don't think they should continue to speak about this idea of 92, 97, 98%, because what we are talking about is territory. We are not talking about 92% of the Palestinians. And I hope that Mr. Darigold and his government will stop resorting to this legal trick that is totally irrelevant and doesn't mean anything to anybody who knows anything about international law.
This has to be the last question because of the time constraints, and I apologize to those who have submitted questions, but we simply don't have much more time. Why is there a double standard with regard to Israeli occupation of Arab lands and Iraqi occupation of Kuwait?
Who are you directing that to?
To either one of you who dare to answer.
There is no double standard for a very simple reason. How did Israel get into the West Bank to begin with? Everyone forgets history. Israel did not initiate the war in 1967. The Straits of Tiran were blocked. Egyptian forces, about 80,000, went into the Sinai on the border of the Negev. The United Nations peacekeeping forces were removed. And even once the front opened up with Egypt, we asked the Jordanians not to open up the front in the West Bank. Our major airport, Lod International Airport, came under bombardment. Jerusalem came under bombardment. And only when Jordan opened fire on Israel with air and artillery attack did Israel respond and take that territory from which it was attacked in a defensive war. So it is a completely different situation. Since then, UN resolutions like Resolution 242 call for secure borders, secure and recognized borders for Israel, not full withdrawal to the 1949 armistice line. So the situation, of course, with Iraq and Kuwait is a war of total aggression of a very large power against a very small country. So there is absolutely no basis of comparison between the Iraqi-Kuwaiti situation and the situation in which Israel found itself in the West Bank in response to a defensive war and seeks to have secure and recognized borders according to UN resolutions.
Of course, you will not be surprised if I totally disagree with the way Mr. Gold interprets history. I mean, this is, everybody knows who shot first, that this was a war of aggression, and that it was not a defensive war. And everybody knows that Israel is required to withdraw from the territories it occupied in 1967. Secure and defensible borders does not equate acquisition of territory, because the Security Council resolution speaks about the acquisition of territory by force. Securing borders does not need annexation of territories, and there are many ways to secure borders. The borders between Egypt and Israel are secure, and the Sinai has been totally liberated from Israeli occupation. But we do not want to discuss to re-fight the wars of 1967. I think all security resolutions should be implemented. Some of them, if you could technically differentiate between those under Chapter 6, Chapter 7, but it is important for the will of the international community to be respected with regard to the situation in the Middle East, in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, everywhere, because it is important for the people to learn to live together and to work together and to respect norms of international law. But we are not going to fight this 1967 war again.
I want to thank both Ambassador Gold and Ambassador Maher Saeed for coming to the Baker Institute at Rice University for this very insightful and very frank exchange at a time when the Arab-Israeli peace process and the Middle East are in a very critical situation. I think it's the fervent hope of everybody, Arabs, Israelis, Americans, Europeans, the world, that the Arab-Israeli peace process certainly move forward for the people. And I'd like to ask Secretary Baker to come and make.
I wasn't supposed to get up here and say anything at the end of this program, but I think you've gotten a very good idea tonight about how difficult this issue is. We started out with the situation today in 1998, and we ended up with the situation in 1967 with the first war. But what I really wanted to do by standing up here was to simply thank both of these ambassadors. Each of them has been an extraordinarily articulate and I think effective and I think forceful advocate of their particular positions. And I hope you've enjoyed the program tonight as much as I have, and I thank you all for coming.
Mr. Secretary, let me say, if I may, that it's a great honor for you to have been with us through this happens in the Middle East. And there are many, many people who do miss you in the Middle East, so we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Come get your present. Thanks for coming very much. Very good program.
Let's say hello.